Utah's BlackHawk War is the name used for the estimated 150 battles, skirmishes, and raids between Mormon settlers and various bands of different native tribes, including the Ute, Southern Paiute, Apache, and Navajo. I will be doing a more detailed video on the BlackHawk War in the future. The causes and even the start date of these conflicts is still debated today. The first signs of conflict came shortly after Mormon settlers started arriving in 1847, and intensified as the years passed, and more settlers started spreading all across what we now know as Utah. By the mid-1860s, the Mormons and Natives in central and southern Utah were in a state of open war, with a seemingly endless stream of raids, counter-raids, and killing on both sides. The epicenter for the fighting was the areas in and around St. Pete and Sevier counties, in central Utah. Now, at the time of these events, the only people living in what we now call Utah were Native Americans and Mormon settlers, and these conflicts took place almost entirely in very remote and rural places. This being the case, the records and details of the BlackHawk War are definitely lacking. That is the reason today's source is an invaluable piece of history. Published in 1919, just 46 years after the end of the BlackHawk War, Indian Depredations in Utah by Peter Gottfredson is a book compiled of stories collected directly from survivors of the BlackHawk War, with Gottfredson spending more than 20 years making sure this history is preserved. This is one of those stories. On the morning of March 21st, 1867, Jens Peter Peterson, his wife, and a 14-year-old neighbor girl named Mary Smith left Richfield in Sevier County, Utah, to go to Glenwood, about 5 miles away, with an ox team to do some trading. The settlers in the area at this time were in agreement that it was not safe for anyone to travel between the settlements without an armed guard, due to the ongoing conflicts with the natives. The Petersons, however, believed they would be safe, as they were leaving early in the morning and were only traveling 5 miles. But they did not account for the dirt road being extremely muddy. This being the case, they were moving at a very slow rate of speed when they reached a place called Black Ridge, east of Sevier River. They then noticed a group of natives gathering stock along the banks of the river. Noticing the people on the road, the natives immediately fell upon the Petersons, quickly killing them and the young Mary Smith. They also killed one of the oxen. Just at this time, 2 boys from Glenwood, Joseph Hendrickson and Joseph Francom, were nearby looking for some cows. They saw 2 people in the distance and said, quote, "There come some boys. We will ask them to help us start the cows." But the 2 boys quickly realized the people they were seeing were Indians and ran towards town. At this, the warriors shot at them, but missed. Hendrickson reached the town first and reported what he had seen. Meanwhile, the natives were pushing their gathered stock north to the crossing of Cove River. The stream was difficult to cross, and they were delayed in getting the stock across. Back at the town, some of the settlers argued that nobody should leave in case the natives attacked Glenwood itself. But when Dr. Elias Pearson called for men to follow him, 10 or more responded, among whom were the following: Dr. Pearson, Artemus Millett, James Killian, J.K. Peterson, Joseph Snow, Archibald Oldroyd, Joseph Herring, George Pectrell, J.K.P. Sampson, and Hans Gottfredson. The men chased after and eventually caught up with the warriors, who were most likely Southern Paiutes or Utes. The 2 parties began trading shots, and the warriors were attempting a fighting retreat to the nearby hills. One of the natives was yelling and waving a blanket in an attempt to stampede the stock, but some of the Mormons were able to get in between the cattle and the hills, and the yelling warrior was wounded. The warriors made it to a small creek, later named Indian Creek, where they made a stand and fought for some time. Here J.K. Peterson is described dodging back and forth on the battlefield, and when seeing an opportunity would stop and shoot, before throwing himself on his back to reload, then repeating the process. With the battle still going, some of the younger boys began to herd the stock back towards town, with about a dozen men coming out of the town to help them. Back at Indian Creek, a man known as the White Horse Chief, Shana Vegan, rode out to the point of the hill and was encouraging his warriors. The men focused their fire on him and drove him back to cover. With the fight showing no signs of slowing down, the Mormon men gathered together and charged up the hill, shooting as they went. A man named John Francom was shot through the shoulder, but the charge was successful, and the warriors retreated into the hills, taking a few horses and mules with them. One of the mules belonging to Peter Oldroyd, it was recovered the next year in the Spring City fight. Now back in Glenwood, the excitement and fear of the fighting wearing off, a man named George Crowther, who had been working on the Glenwood fort, decided to head for home. A number of men who had participated in the fight went along to escort him. It was during this escort that the men came across the murdered Petersons. Now at the time of the killings, another young boy named Old Bork was nearby also looking for cattle. He heard the shooting and saw some warriors. He ran to Richfield and alerted the town. A number of men immediately left to help the Petersons, but arrived too late to save them. They returned to town to discuss the next course of action. It was decided that 10 men from Richfield would go after the natives. Shortly after the escort party from Glenwood reached the site of the killings, they crossed paths with these 10 avenging men from Richfield. The scene was brutal. Just as the warriors shot their oxen, the 3 people jumped from the wagon and started to run. They didn't get far. Mr. Peterson had been shot and then beaten to death. He had also been scalped. Mrs. Peterson and young Mary Smith did not make it much farther. Both women were stripped naked and were horribly mutilated. The men from both Glenwood and Richfield immediately set out after the natives. They headed up Indian Creek and followed the trail until the head of Lost Creek, where they eventually returned home. The men on both sides of this conflict would go on to fight each other for years to come.